It wasn't fair. Anyway, we'll move on. The next speaker who's going to present is Gail Neufeld, and she's a local poverty rights activist. And and Gail, thank you.
My brain just kind of shuts off and everything leaves my brain and I won't have anything to talk about. So I wrote everything down and wrote it big enough so I can see it from a long way. Well, Mr. Camp, our Member of Parliament, says you can't get on a plane without showing government-issued ID. I'd like to point out that getting on an airplane is not a civil right. Voting is. And to get on a plane these days, we may also need to be x-rayed and strip-searched. I certainly hope it won't come to that for us to exercise our right to vote. All Canadian citizens at the age of 18 have the right to vote. Voter turnout was far too low as it is. Why place obstacles in the way of those rights and freedoms that Canadians believe are necessary to maintain a free and democratic society? The 300-page bill is so convoluted that I don't think people realize what's happening. I'm afraid by the time they do, it'll be a done deal. The most precious thing we have to maintain a democracy is one person, one vote. When you look at people who may not be able to vote because of this bill, and then look at the limitations that are being put on the chief electoral officer, you have to wonder how after this bill we will have a truly fair and inclusive election process. With Bill 23, I can imagine us possibly going backward in time. It's quite astonishing to realize that there was a time in Canadian history where the number of people who were allowed to vote was actually much smaller than the number who were not. The idea of cheating at election time has been brought up as the reason for doing away with vouching to cast a ballot. But the numbers of cheaters are so very, very low that this should never be allowed to stand in the way of our civil liberties. I often think of my grandmother, how when she was born in Canada in 1901, she was not even considered a person under the law until 1929. And being a woman would not have the right to vote until 1918. Of course, then she would need to wait until she turned 21, the voting age until 1970, when it was lowered to age 18. In 1982, the new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms embedded in the Constitution the right of all citizens to vote. Some people with disabilities were not allowed to vote until 1988. In 1992, Parliament amended the Act to improve access to electoral system for persons with disabilities. Bill 23 will particularly affect the disabled, seniors, young voters, students, Aboriginal peoples, the poor, the homeless, and victims of family violence, all of whom can have a more difficult time keeping their ID in order. Anyone who finds themselves thrust into a less fortunate situation can have difficulties obtaining and keeping their identification in order, especially if for some reason they have needed to leave their home in a hurry. The most dangerous time for a battered wife is when they are leaving. In 1989, I left my abusive husband and my home with my 3 children and little more than I could carry in the car. I and my 3 children would need to go to hiding for 9 months, moving 6 times in the first 6. I very distinctly remember an argument I had with a caring voice in my head. that day as I was leaving my home in a terrible, frantic rush, not knowing yet that it would be for the last time, because my abusive husband would attach me deadbolt to the door of our home on the day I left. I was really frightened because it was getting late and was worried about him catching me trying to leave. Though I normally don't hear voices in my head, I clearly heard this one tell me to get mine and the children's birth certificates. I remember saying out loud, "There's not enough time. I'll come back tomorrow while he's gone." In my head, I distinctly heard, "There is enough time. Get them now." I very reluctantly re-unlocked the front door, went back into my home, and got our birth certificates and some of my other documents that were then close at hand. And I got away, not knowing on that day that I would never be allowed back, except for a brief moment 9 months later with a BC Supreme Court order in hand and a police escort with a moving van. There to retrieve my things, where I discovered a moving van was not required because most of my things were gone. This was from a mortgage-free home that I had designed and built myself. Imagine for a moment if you were homeless. Where would you keep your important documents? Could you keep them safe and dry? If you have no safe place you can call your own to rest your head, who's looking after your documents while you're sleeping? I cannot help but think about how much more difficult my life would have been if I had not gone back into my home that last possible moment before I left. I needed that identification constantly. This bill will make it yet more difficult for those in these kinds of impossible situations.